Hey, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the session E1 for the International Committee of ASFPM. We've got a pretty interesting slate of presenters lined up for you today. First of all, we're going to hear from Alejandro Riano and Jay Springer are going to talk about flood risk management along the Rio Grande on the U.S.-Mexico border. Uh, as a way of introducing, let me describe Alejandro's background. Alejandro is a senior water resource engineer with AECOM's Phoenix, Arizona office. He's also an active member of our international committee, and he heads up our area that looks at Latin America and Caribbean flood risk management issues. Joining Alejandro today is going to be Jay Springer. He's a principal and licensed engineer in for Northern Engineering and Consulting in Montana. He has 30 years of engineering and survey experience along the Canadian border. And so the two of them are going to share a presentation on international flood risk management along the U.S. borders.
Good morning. I'm Jay Springer, and I'm a CFM. I'm with Northern Engineering and Consulting. We're going to be doing this presentation with the International Committee of ASFPM. It's on flood risk management along the U.S. border. That includes Canada and Mexico. I'm going to give a brief introduction, and I'll be doing it along with Alejandro Riano, and he will go into a deeper study that was done along the Rio Grande with Mexico. I'm going to just talk a little bit about why we have the International Boundary Commission or International Committee, and why and the differences between the north and south borders. First, we just like to give a quick acknowledgement. Apurba Bora, he's got a whole bunch of letters behind his name. Very knowledgeable gentleman, and did a lot of the research on the presentation for the Rio Grande that Alejandro will be doing later. David Powers, another guy with a whole bunch of letters, well known in the ASFPM world, really helpful, really sharp guy. And Ping Shang, another gentleman with a lot of knowledge, a lot of letters behind his name, and just without these guys, he did research on that project as well, and without these guys, this would not be possible. So thank you, gentlemen. So let's go to the introduction. I got a few talking points that I want to tell you about. Number one is we want to talk about the difference between the north and south border. The north border is called the International Boundary Commission. It manages the water treaty with U.S. and Canada. To the south is the International Boundary and Water Commission. I'll talk a little bit more on the next slide about that, but you guys know that a lot of countries have, water treaties. And these are super important, how we manage them and how water's dispersed and flows through from one country to another. How do we make those watersheds and floodplain management, how do we make those water compacts and agreements work together beneficially? The old saying, some people get killed by water, some die from dehydration. That's Mekong Mahamana. I think I said that right. Anyway, what he's saying there is how we manage water. It's about perception really, but it deals with us. How do we get from one to another? How do we make that water work and still protect people from flooding? This does not mean that the housing market's flooded. That's my attempt at some humor. So floods, they're a natural climate-driven process. They're part of the water cycle and supply floodplain with sediment and nutrients. And they don't care about political borders. They're going to flow where they're going to flow. Floodplains are attractive places for human settlement. Vulnerability tools may depend on human activities. So what do we do? Like here where I'm at, I'm in Havre, Montana. It's up north. It's just 40 miles south of the Canadian border. And we have real broad, shallow flooding. We control it mostly with levees. The Corps of Engineers is an intricate part of that. So transboundary cooperation on flood risk management is not only necessary, but beneficial. How do we get waters that need to flow from one country to another in a manner that also we don't impact the floodplains. How do we manage all that? So the U.S.-Canada Treaty, it was done in 1809. As you can see, there's the different dates when it was ratified. 1910. It was proclaimed, so it came into fruition in May 13th of 1910. There were some notable changes in 1912 and a lot of rules and procedural changes in 1964, which was a huge flooding year for a lot of places along the northern tier boundary. The comparison, the International Boundary Commission is US and Canada. And so that was established in 1908. As we saw that, the International Boundary and Water Commission is U.S. and Mexico, and that was established in 1848. So a lot of the same functions, a little bit different name. We have 5,525 miles along the U.S.-Canadian border. We have a whole bunch of it right here in Montana, about 700 miles of it. And they have 1,954 down south. We share various lakes and connecting rivers. And you can see, I'm not going to go through each one of those, but you can see the differences in the amount of shared border and shared water. So the problems and needs. So the drainage basins, not flows, but drainage basins that span international boundaries. How do we dictate policy on that? And the whole reason for this international committee is so we could share ideas. What works? What doesn't work? What have we done in the past that was really successful? One of the big deals up here is irrigation. We're an agricultural economy up here still. And we're an arid climate as well. And so the water that comes from the Milk River to irrigate this whole area, it generates a ton of hay, millions of tons, and more wheat than you could shake a stick out. I grew up on a farm out north of Havre, just below the Canadian border, and it's big wheat country. So how do we get that water down here from up there, but still allow them to control their flooding? Here's some flood pictures. This is the kind of broad, wide flooding I was talking about. These are towns just to the east of the little town that I live in, but you can see it's not real deep flooding. Here's the levee system that here in my little town, I'd be right over here somewhere talking to you right now, that this is the levee system that controls the Milk River through this town, done by the Corps of Engineers. Here's the shared drainage basin. The St. Mary's River and the Milk River drainage basins, those two flow into each other, and it's a huge area. And Havre would be right about here, so we're right where I'm talking from. And so how do we make these treaties that have been well thought out? How do we take the waters from there and make the treaties reality? How do we control flooding yet still generate the flows that are required? And then I'll hand it off to Alejandro now, where he does a detailed study of the Mexico border and the Rio Grande project.
So thank you, Jay. Yes, so to complement Jay's comparison here, now that we have it in a graphical form, we can see that the differences between the northern border, which in north we have the Alaska having a large boundary with Canada, and a very long land portions between Canada and the United States. Specifically, 13 states of the United States have international borders with the 8 territories in Canada. So that in comparison to the 2,000 miles across the southern border, which half of it is for the Rio Grande, which has a boundary about 1,200 miles. That compares to only about 300 miles of water boundary through the northern border. There is only 4 United States in the United States that share border with 5 states in Mexico. And one of the major rivers is the Rio Grande. We have other important rivers like the Colorado River and the Tijuana River, which have a small border portion in the southern border. So hi, my name is Alejandro Riano, and I am going to be talking to you today, discussing kind of more informational discussion on the International Boundary Water Commission and how they establish the design flows for the lower Rio Grande region that's on the east portion of the southern border with Mexico. I will briefly touch into the history. I will discuss briefly about the flood control and the structures and water management that occurs across the border in this region. How this area is very hurricane susceptible, and how did they translate that into design floods for this region, and what comes out of it. And at the end, I'll have a discussion on how that design compares to the local policies, very briefly. So again, after the U.S.-Mexican War, the United States and Mexico establishes they establish a treaty in which they designate a commission that's in charge of going and determining where the new U.S.-Mexico border is located. And they do repeat this cycle throughout time for 50 years until 1900s, where they actually make this commission a permanent commission, and it's then called the International Boundary. They function like this for until 1944, a time in which they recognize the need of collaboration between the two countries and the need for big projects along the Rio Grande. And then they designate this boundary commission with a new name and the new mission of managing waters across the United States and Mexico border, and it's now called the International Water Boundary Commission. So now at this point, they also are designated to have an engineer sitting on each of the sections of the commission. So the main mission of the International Boundary Water Commission is, and I'm just going to briefly discuss it, is to survey the location of the U.S. boundary, is to provide flood protection and water allocation and manage the water resources across boundary lands, resolve disputes between the two countries that are related to border issues, and to share the costs of the different projects, including also the attention to water quality, which is becoming more and more important, because water resources is so important. So the International Boundary, as you can see, has very, very many projects along. The IBWC has many projects across the border, across the 2,000 miles or 1,900 miles of border that we have. And of the 1,200 miles, there is also a number of projects that they do flood control, they do reroute waters to Mexico, and do water treatment efforts between the exchange of waters between the border. Today, I will be discussing and I will be focusing on this region of the Rio Grande, where you can see the Falcon Dam, which is typically called the Lower Rio Grande Valley. So, along this region of the Rio Grande, there are a number of structures that are designated for two basic purposes. One is to control flood. I mean, the main purpose, one of the purposes is to control floods, but then also there is the purpose of create hydroelectricity, and then to divert the waters of the river. So the Amistad Dam, which is shown on top of this map, shows you can see the pond behind it. The reason is because it works as a power plant. And the same thing for Falcon Dam. Other locations along the river are used to divert the waters to provide the allocations that the IBWC has established during in its long time of treaties. Now, I'm going to zoom into this area, and I know there's a lot of information going through, and I'm kind of flying through it, but this shows you a picture of this region of the lower Rio Grande below Falcon Dam, in where there is a number of structures. There are major cities like Rio Grande, Reynosa, and Matamoros, where the Rio Grande passes through, and there are multiple areas where these dams work. So we have the Andalus Dam, which is a picture, Falcon Dam, which we have a picture here shown in the area. The picture here is shown for Andalus Dam, that's located here in Reynosa. And then Retamal Dam, which is these two are diversion dams. And then we have Matamoros located here. There are other structures in addition to the dams in this region, which are the floodways. And these floodways are not the same as the FEMA floodways. These floodways are meant to provide flood protection and meant to distribute the water and route the water for irrigation. And they're not necessarily FEMA floodways. There is about 270 miles of levees that have been allocated along the reach for the U.S. section, and this is the map. So that's what this map is showing. So this region is very susceptible for flooding, especially is very susceptible for hurricane events to land on this region. And the next slide is going to discuss about the hurricane, an event that occurred in 1967 that was key for this region, as it provides the routes of the design floods are used to design, build, and designate the waters across the region. So what happened was, in 1967, Hurricane Beulah, in September 36, started as a depression in the Caribbean, and it took about 14 days to travel all the way to this region. So near September 20th, was arriving to the region as a catastrophic hurricane. And then it stayed in the region for about 2 days, pouring rainfall, and just causing havoc in the region. So in those 2 days, the rainfall was in the vicinity of 15 to 25 inches spread. This region, by the way, is very flat. There is not much of a there are not many ways for water to go, so it tends to pond, and then this essentially turned this region into a lake. Those floodways that I just mentioned before fail in a few places because they were not prepared for this type of event. There is just a lot of wind damage for the event, and also because of the number of tornadoes that occur due to this strong hurricane event. So in this slide, what really kind of drives, I like this chart a lot because it shows how the impact of rainfall was. So and in comparison to what happened inland to what happened in the coast. So, for example, the rainfall, flood. So to the right, you'll see the impact to the coast. So that was significant, but inland, that was categorized devastating because the rainfall just stayed there forever and there was no infiltration, nothing. So just water just stayed there. Then we have the wind. Of course, having a hurricane with 163 miles per hour winds was more devastating in the coast than you would expect to be on land. Now, storm surge, of course, there was no impact, at least measurable impact on land. So that's why there's no shown, but definitely it was devastating on the coast side. Now, tornadoes where it caused havoc on both land and the coast. There was a lot of damage here, especially because the industry that thrives here is agricultural. And when you have a large area without any access to roads, it's pretty much just air or water type of access. It really restricts people from getting help, especially when the floods stay from the river, keep the flood levels high because of the delay effect of the event. So it was devastating. Here is a picture of the rainfall distribution in the region. You can see this is the Falcon Dam, and right here is where the Rio Grande is located, city of Rio Grande, and here is the border with Mexico. These are some images from the flooding. If you're trying to survive the floods, then you have to hide from the wind. If you need food after a couple of weeks that you're staying in the location, you can see how hard that can be and how disastrous can be. So it takes about 2 years after this event for IBWC to recognize that they need to have better protection, and they settled in a design flood based on a number of studies that they did in the region, and they adopted it, and then is posted in the minute 238 that was developed, came to an agreement 2 years after in 1969, which designated these flow discharges along the river. Note that the discharge at the Rio Grande, the design discharge, is 250,000 CFS. The Hurricane Beulah actual discharge that was estimated by the USGS at the time was nearly 200,000 CFS, and the design flow is actually greater than that. So even though this Hurricane Beulah was a unique event, it led to actually develop a design protection that was greater than that event, which is much greater than the 100-year event that you would use, at least on the United States side, for design purposes. So you can see that that after this new design event, a lot of the infrastructure was improved along the Rio Grande, and now it's protecting all the region from the flooding of the river. This region, and now the risk that's associated with this, it also has to do with the size of the region. At the time, there was only about 350,000 people living in the region. Now there is about probably close to 2 million people living in the region now. So these levee protections now are allowing the development in the region. So to conclude here, I would like to say that US IBWC follows the criteria established by FEMA in building levees in the US section, in the US portion of the river. but the design flood is much greater than 1% of it, which protects the region or the inland or the floodplain from the flood to the Rio Grande, but in turn it uh, it creates sometimes problems along its locations because interior drainage can go against the protection of the levees. Another point is that Mexico uses different criteria to build levees. Also, at the moment of this presentation, IBWC conducts regular emergency exercises just in preparation for the hurricane season, as we recently have repetitive strong events occurring in the region. They do have that task to prepare, as they're the custodians of big structures that prevent flooding. Due to the pandemic, they have adapted using virtual resources, and they have also the resources to arrive to locations and visit, devastated regions. It was noted that at a point in 2008, there was a devastated region, and unfortunately, during one of the site visits, one of the U.S. section commissioner died during their travel to the region. Now that we're talking about the Rio Grande and the protection that the IBWC provides to the region, does that mean that the flood is gone? Flood risk is still there. It's just now that risk has become minimal, and it's going to be just related to rainfall events. But the flood risk is still there. It's just changed due to the new protections or the protections as a result of events like Hurricane Viola in the region. With this, I would like to thank everybody for attending this presentation, and we'll just move on to questions and answers. Thank you.
So we've got Alejandro and Jay here with us, and we've got a special guest, which is Dr. Apurva Bora, who's the lead hydraulic engineer for the IBWC. Apurva, can I get you to say just a few words about your role at IBWC?
Yeah, IBWC is the International Boundary and Water Commission. It's a binational organization. We have both US and Mexican section. And we look at all the projects from San Diego, California, and all the way to Brownsville, Texas. That's about 2,000 miles. And we see that no projects on either country actually does not impact any hydraulic impact to the other country. Like if we do something here in US, like currently all the border wall projects, we make sure that there is no hydraulic impact to Mexico. And also we keep track of the water sharing between US and Mexico for Rio Grande. We provide about 60,000 acre feet at Juarez through International Diversion Dam. And also in downstream, like Lower Rio Grande, we get about 350,000 acre feet from Mexico. But these are not like every year. This is just on an average for 5 years. So maybe you get 1 year 3,000 acre feet, then you get next year like 400,000. It should be on an average, 5-year average, those water sharing accounts.
Yeah. So we have a question from Randy asking about, is the water level in the reservoirs on the Rio Grande lowered when they see a hurricane coming?
Yes. We keep actually enough storage. Actually, that's the role of U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They keep track of all the reservoirs and then ask whoever actually manage those dams. So they have to lower water level to keep enough flood storage.
Yeah.
And this year it's a very actually low, it's a drought year. Water levels are low.
One of the things that I've seen in the news here recently are the issues with the levees that were compromised, in the construction process for building the border wall. Can you speak about the how that's going to be addressed leading up to hurricane season this year?
Yes, actually, in some parts, those border walls act as a flood wall against our levee, and there are some cuts, about 10 cuts in the lower Rio Grande. But Corps of Engineers actually, they're the project managers for CBP. They already started working on those levee gaps, and they have also actually emergency flood management. If anything happens on June 1st. And they already started working on those levee gaps. Yeah.
So we're confident that those will be repaired before
Yeah.
hurricane season starts. That's good to hear.
Yeah, they started working, but even if it does not, it's not complete. So, but there are emergency actually flood management plan.
Excellent.
Dr. Bora, so one thing that we mentioned in the presentation was that the IBWC does an emergency exercise, and you're currently doing an emergency exercise right now. Could you provide us with a brief description of what tasks are done?
Yeah, before flood season, actually flood season starts from June 1st. So before that, we do actually binational exercise. But right now that's going on actually yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And immediately after this meeting, actually I will go to that meeting. And this time we are doing it actually in a virtual environment. Before that, we meet face to face and we visit all the dams and all the structures and also go through some emergency action plan so that we are ready to actually manage flood when it comes.
Fantastic. Question from Crystal. Put this open to either Alejandro or Apurva, but if one entity, speaking of the U.S. versus Mexico, if one entity does a project, how do you look at the balance of the allowable effect on the opposite bank? In other words, if what are the tools that we have in our toolbox if Mexico wants to do a project that may affect flood elevations on the U.S. side, or vice versa?
Yeah, there are actually boundary treaty, and based on that, we cannot hydraulically impact on the other side of the river. Suppose someone builds something on the floodplain, so they have to prove it that no, it will not impact either side. And right now we have criteria for Rio Grande. That's about, you cannot increase water surface elevation more than 6 inches in rural areas and more than 3 inches in urban areas. And also you cannot deflect more than 5% water. Like right now we are building that border wall, that CBP's border wall. We also actually reviewed all those projects. They did both 1D and 2D hydraulic models to show that no, there is no hydraulic impact. They have to be within those threshold. And we share also all these projects and everything with Mexico. Even they review those projects and make sure that no, it is within the threshold.
And I guess just as an extension to that, that would go against extending the height of levees as well.
Yes.
Got a question from Janet, probably directed at Jay. I live in a northern border state, which is Maine. I don't usually hear much about flooding in Canada. Is there a news source or some agency where international boundary and water information is available?
Yeah, there is. It's The International Joint Commission, who actually wrote the treaty between US and Canada, they have links. They don't have specific news on their site, but they have links that'll take you to. There's also floods.canada, and that would I might not have said that website exactly right, but they have information on their flooding as well. If you just Google that, there's news sites, but there's also actual government sites that show you impacts that are going on.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just add, Janet, if you want to get in touch with either Anna or myself with the International Committee, we do track flood news stories month to month, and we see a lot from Canada, and so I've got a few sources that we can share with you as well. William Lang asked, what kind of response and recovery challenges have we experienced in the past? Disputes on the insurance side regarding source of flooding, et cetera. I would assume that he's referring to the southern border. Apurva, do you have can you speak to the response and recovery challenges on the southern border?
Yeah, we don't have like along the Rio Grande that will be flooded on both sides, but sometimes in small towns there may be a transboundary flooding, because of stormwater impact. In fact, Alejandro, he worked on a project in Douglas, Arizona to alleviate those flood issues.
Yes. So sometimes, depending on where you look at along the southern border, there are opportunities and communities collaborate because they share, even though they have a border in between, they typically share resources, and some of it has to do with drainage. So when it happens, it depends which side of where you are. So if you're in the United States, then FEMA is what helps you, and when you're outside of the states, and then is whatever is available in Mexico to aid. So when we have issues across the border, the communities along the border try to cooperate, and so as far as insurance wise, there is just a cooperation, because some of these events are they might be frequent, but they are also the challenges regarding the way the communities develop, and they develop with different standards. So you might have a city on the border that has a lot of protection, and then you have the other cities out of border that has less protection in some areas.
Sounds good. Looks like we're running out of time here, so I'm going to suggest to Joe and Ben that we will respond to your comments offline, and appreciate everyone's participation there. And I'd like to thank Alejandro, Jay, and Dr. Bora for joining us to talk about a significant, flood risk management challenge here in the U.S. Our next presentation is going to go across the Atlantic, and we're going to look at the Rhine River, and the title of this is The Complexity of Transnational Cooperation, 70 Years of International River Basin Flood Management along the Rhine River. And so we're pleased to introduce Marc Daniel Heintz, who is the Executive Secretary for the International Commission for the Protection of the Rhine. Marc Daniel studied geography with a focus on natural hazards. He's worked for the Bavarian Environment Agency in the Department of Flood and Risk Management, and for the Municipal Drainage Company in Cologne, Germany. with that, I will turn it over to his presentation.
Dear colleagues, thanks very much for having us here as guests from Europe. We would have loved to come to the US, but due to the pandemic, we're joining you online. My name is Marc Daniel, and together with my colleague Adrian, I would like to share some ideas on flood risk management from Europe with you. And I'll just share my slides with you. Our special thanks go to our US American colleague Kay, who helped us to make our presentation more comprehensible for you as a US American audience. So let's see how it works out. Flood risk management in Europe. I would like to begin that topic by introducing the River Rhine to you, and I'll do so by comparing it to the Mississippi River, which you might know. The Rhine is only 1/3 as long as the Mississippi, and its basin is 15 times smaller than the Mississippi. However, there are 60 million inhabitants living in its basin, and that is just twice as many as the 30 million inhabitants of the Mississippi basin. And whereas the Mississippi basin comprises the USA and actually also a very small share of Canada, in case of the Rhine, it's 9 nations with 3 different languages spoken, and that's German, French, and Dutch. So just like the Mississippi, the Rhine is an important river for inland navigation, but the population density of its basin and also the degree of its industrialization is much higher, and therefore also the flood risk, which actually requires a good management. So this is where the ICPR comes into play. Who or what is actually the ICPR? Well, the ICPR is one of the oldest river basin commissions in the world. We were founded 70 years ago, and yeah, you could say it's a success story, but it's also full of setbacks, and that makes it actually interesting. Just imagine the situation back in 1950, only 5 years after World War II, and those neighboring countries, which had just been enemies fighting against each other some years before, they came to the conclusion that water doesn't stop at administrative boundaries, so they had to work together, and that's what they did. So, whereas in the 1950s, the Rhine was a dirty and stinking river, 30 years later, it had actually recovered, the water quality had improved. So this was a first success. So everything all right? Well, not, because in 1986, a horrible accident happened in Switzerland due to a fire in an industrial area. Tons of pesticides spilled into the river. So on a length of more than 200 kilometers, the river was practically dead. And those pictures of tons of dead fish came as a shock to the local population. So what the countries actually did is they united their forces again and set up the Rhine Action Program 1 year later, which aimed at introducing a warning system for such kind of accidents so that it wouldn't happen again, or that at least countries could react quickly, but also at bringing back species that had almost gone extinct, like the salmon. In the 1990s, 2 other events struck the population along the Rhine, 2 catastrophic winter floods in only 13 months, and they caused a damage of approximately $6 billion. So as a reaction, the countries set up the Flood Action Plan Rhine with ambitious measures. As you can already see, disasters have triggered the evolution of our commission, and they led to new initiatives. So finally, they've also led to the adoption of our new programs, Rhine 2020, and last year, Rhine 2040. So yeah, the ICPR is today responsible for the international coordination of water quality, ecology topics, flood risk management, low water events, and climate change adaptation. You could say actually all water related tasks except shipping, because there is another commission for river navigation. And how does the everyday work in our commission actually look like? Well, the legal basis of our commission is an international treaty. It defines, for example, which nation contributes how much money to our commission, and then the practical work itself is done in expert groups, which actually means that the states send their national experts in order to work on relevant topics, such as, for instance, the identification of locations for flood retention basins and the calculation of their effects. And that's what they do in our working groups. And afterwards, they're producing reports, and those technical reports are adopted by our plenary session. And once they're adopted, they are also published on our website, and they're available to the general public. All decisions in our commission are taken by consensus, which means that actually if a conflict arises, that means negotiating until a compromise can be found, just like on an international summit. There are no sanctions, so decisions agreed on those conferences are actually political promises. And also all measures mentioned in our programs and agreed on in our conferences, such as the construction of a fish pass, for instance, or a flood retention basin, all of those are implemented by the nations themselves, so they remain responsible for the implementation. Our commission is the place where the countries come together, they set the objectives, and they also evaluate regularly the progress they have made in order to achieve those objectives. Therefore, we have a secretariat with 10 employees, and we have 3 working languages, German, French, and Dutch, which means all documents are translated into those languages, and also all the meetings have simultaneous interpretation. But now let's move on to flooding. And before I do so, I would like to give you some insights into flood hazard terminology in Europe, because there is a directive and a topic, and there are actually 3 scenarios all over Europe. Let's start with the medium probability scenario, which has a return period of once in 100 years. Then we also have an extreme event scenario with no clearly defined return period that most nations actually take once in a 500 or once every 1,000 years, which actually means that this is really a flood event where the technical protection cannot cope anymore, dikes are flooded. And then we also have a high probability flood event with a return period of once in 10 years up to 20 years. So what actually happened in our commission is that the nations agreed on common runoff values for all of those 3 scenarios. For example, as you see in the table here, in the last line in Llobet, which is a village on the Dutch-German border, so between this village of Llobet and the North Sea, the agreed runoff value for an extreme event scenario in the River Rhine is 16,000 cubic meters per second, just to give an example. And that's what they did for all river sections and for all events, so that, yeah, actually all flood maps and so on have the same standards. Now I would like to continue with some photos. They were taken 3 years ago in January 2018. You see streets, houses, and flooded areas. Some areas are still protected. And when we compare those photos to the situation in the 1990s, I mentioned before, the water level in the 1990s was actually 2 meters higher than on the photos. So just imagine the damage. And just imagine the situation. Cities in Europe are densely populated, they are old, they're often close to rivers. So yeah, the damage that can happen is immense. However, the flooding in the mid-1990s, when you compare it to our terminology, has a return period of once in 50 years. So actually it's somewhere between a medium and a high probability flood event. Risk analysis, however, has shown that the damage potential for an extreme flood event in the whole Rhine River Basin would be around 80 billion US dollars, with 5 million inhabitants at risk of flooding. So yeah, the countries really knew they had to do something and invest in measures. So in Europe, since let's say around the year 2000 or 2005, there has been a paradigm shift. Before, everybody referred to flood control or flood protection because the idea was to have flooding completely under control and to protect the population. Whereas some years later, scientists and also decision makers started to speak of flood risk management. What does that mean? Well, the idea behind this holistic approach is that actually technical flood protection is one component of the whole system, but it's not the only solution. We also have natural water retention, for instance, or in order to avoid new risk, we're also looking into spatial planning, we're looking into building permissions, and we're trying to inform our population so that they can, for example, get an insurance. Some of these topics are dealt with on an international level, and I would like to give you some more concrete examples on that. Well, one of the most important topics with large-scale effects, of course, is flood retention alongside the river and in its catchment. And there are calculations in Europe that since 1800, up to 90% of the natural floodplains were lost. And I mean, just look at those images. You can see that the Rhine has changed from a wild, braided, meandering river into a straightened watercourse. It almost looks like a canal. They did it in order to make it more navigable for ships and to gain new farmland. But the other side of the coin is, of course, that flood hazards have increased. So states understood that they had to do something and give back space to the river so that when it bursts its banks, it actually floods wetlands instead of built up areas without causing damage to humans. So the objective of our Rhine 2020 program was therefore to reactivate 160 square kilometers of floodplains by 2020. Last year, we did an assessment and found out that we achieved to reactivate 140 square kilometers. So the objective was almost achieved, but still, this is a huge success. And therefore, in the Rhine 2040 program, our countries, our nations have agreed to reactivate an additional 200 square kilometers in the next 20 years. It is, of course, completely unrealistic to build back 90% of the floodplains that have been destroyed in the past centuries. This would mean that we had to relocate entire settlements or industrial areas, which is impossible. But therefore, the international agreed strategy is a combination of nature-based solutions, such as dike removals, levee removals, but also technical retention areas. The advantage of those projects is that those areas can be flooded via an inlet at the perfect moment in time, just shortly before a flood peak approaches. Here are some examples. An impressive one from my point of view is this image from the Dutch city of Nijmegen. They wanted to give the river back more room, and what they did is they built actually a second river branch, and therefore they had to relocate 25 houses, including the house of a famous TV weather forecast presenter. So just imagine the situation. They really had to gain acceptance among the local population, but they succeeded because a couple of years ago the project was inaugurated, and now this helps to lower the water level during a medium probability flood event by up to 30 centimeters. A smaller project and a technical one is the retention area in Cologne, Germany. And that area can be flooded just shortly before a medium probability flood peak approaches the city center, and therefore the water level can be reduced by up to 10 centimeters, which is, it sounds few, but it is important because the city center is protected by mobile defenses, and really every centimeter counts in order to avoid that they are flooded. We have a list of retention measures that is updated regularly. At first glance, the chart looks a bit confusing, but it actually reflects the variety of measures that have been realized, are in construction, or being planned. And all those, each single symbol actually is the result of the coordinated efforts of 9 nations, all concerned with the same river. Since 1995, the retention volume has been doubled, and we're aiming to increasing it even more by 2030. Another topic we are working on is the improvement of flood forecasting and flood warning. And with our continuous effort, we have achieved to double the forecasting period for most river sections of the Rhine since the 1990s. This is crucial, and this is really important in order to inform the population via apps or on the internet, in order to enable them to prepare themselves against a flood event. Even in Europe, we believe that the state cannot organize everything, and citizens have to take own measures too. But therefore, they must have free access to information, for example, as regards if they're living in a flood-prone area or not, and if yes, to which extent. And therefore, flood maps are nowadays available for all major European rivers. In our commission, we have the Rhine Atlas. It is an online mapping service that extends from the Swiss mountains to the Dutch North Sea, showing the affected areas, the water depth, and the land use for those 3 scenarios which I've presented earlier in my presentation. And this is now available on the internet, free for everybody. You've probably already noticed that we like facts and figures in our commission. So last year we did a major assessment of our Rhine 2020 program and found out that so far 16 billion US dollars were invested in flood risk management measures in all of our nations. And as a result, according to our calculations, the risk of damage potential has been reduced by around 25%. So our new objective written down in the Rhine 2040 program is to further reduce it by an additional 15%, despite climate change and despite a growing population in Europe. All our measures are also described in our International Flood Risk Management Plan Rhine, which you can find on our website. Now, I would like to conclude my presentation with a rather personal opinion on the success factors and challenges in our commission. First of all, I do believe that it is a success factor that we are a coordination-based commission, which means we do have common objectives, but our nations remain responsible for the implementation of the measures because they know best what is the situation in their villages and cities. They know their populations and stakeholders. It is a challenge that there are sometimes different priorities in the different nations, so a compromise is needed, and the consensus principle can be exhausting during conferences or before conferences too. But I'm really convinced that this principle makes sure that afterwards, when everybody goes home, everybody also identifies with the decisions taken because they see them as their decisions and make sure measures are implemented. There's also good interplay between technical expertise and political decisions. Those decisions are taken on the basis of good knowledge and facts on the table. In addition, we must not forget that we have a long-standing tradition of an ecology movement since the 1980s, and also a tradition of multilateralism in our nations, which actually means that we are all convinced that cooperation makes us stronger. And in such a densely populated area, you cannot say my country first. That would lead us nowhere. Finally, we shouldn't forget too that there is no economic gap between the Rhine nations. All of them are relatively wealthy, and I admit that this makes cooperation also a lot easier. So, finally, you'll find more background information on our website, and you can follow us on Twitter. And now I'm really looking forward to our questions and answer session. And thanks very much for your interest in our commission.
So thanks to Marc Daniel for a good presentation, and happy to have him join us here to address some of these questions that are starting to come in. The first question is, are the probability references the same as what FEMA uses? For example, a medium probability equals a 1% annual exceedance probability or a 100-year flood.
Yes, I think I mentioned it on one of my slides, but I can go into it again. We don't have exceedance probabilities in percentage. We refer to return period like once in 100 years, for example, and in Europe we have a high probability event, which is optional, and that is not officially defined. Then we have a medium probability event, and this is once in 100 years or less frequent. So really 99% of the countries take once in 100 years. And then we have an extreme event, and there's also no official definition, but most countries take once in 500 years, once in 1,000 years. So this is really a flood event where the technical flood protection cannot cope anymore with the flooding, and dikes and embankments are flooded. There is maybe one extreme case, it's the Netherlands. They have such a strong technical flood protection, especially against coastal flooding, that they define an extreme event as once in 10,000 years, because otherwise they wouldn't really visualize that risk. So it's some kind of flexibility up to the countries.
And I guess all of that comes out of the EU's flood directive.
Exactly.
Does the EC have any influence on the International Commission for the Protection of the Rhine?
Well, the European Commission has influence on the member countries. So if they don't comply with the obligation, like, for example, publishing flood maps, they can get sued by the European Commission. whereas we as the Rhine Commission have a coordinating role. So the European Commission cannot sue us in a law case or something like that. They are a member of our commission, so they have just as much influence as the other 8 delegations have. And that's also sometimes a funny situation because the European Union, represented by the European Commission in our Rhine Commission, kind of sometimes takes our Rhine Commission or uses our Rhine Commission in order to get a different perspective also on their own policies.
Okay, from Alyssa, are the plans and solutions for the Rhine able to be applied on the tributaries, such as the Neckar and the Moselle? It may not be pronouncing those correctly. Is there a community desire to use the methods on those watercourses too?
Actually, our responsibilities refer to bigger tributaries of the Rhine too. It's defined as tributaries with a catchment area of more than 1,000 square kilometers are kind of our scope. And for the Moselle, which is the second biggest tributary, there's also an own international commission of those 3 member states, Germany, France, and Luxembourg. But we closely work together with them too.
Okay.
But this makes sense also to have a separate one because, for example, Netherlands is not included there, so they don't need Dutch as a language. They only have 2.
Interesting. So this is a comment, and I haven't read through it, so I'm just going to read it live here and see where we end up. This is great. Wonderful to see the reactivation of the floodplain as a priority for flood risk management on a major river. How have the overall benefits to the system from this floodplain storage been quantified? Is the updated as additional storage comes online? Oh, is this updated as additional storage comes online, or just local impacts considered?
There are normally calculations. We also used to have an expert group valuations with modeling experts from all our member states, and they calculated the effect of it. They used to calculate the centimeter effect of lowering a flood peak, but now this perspective has kind of changed because risk is coming more into the focus, not only water level, but also damage potential and so on. But it's complicated, of course, because the effect of, if you have, for example, a flood retention area somewhere at the lower Rhine, then it has an effect on that area and maybe 20 kilometers downstream. And if you are talking about another section of the Rhine, the upper Rhine, then there are also retention areas, and all of them have like a medium scale effect. So it's very difficult to quantify the effect for the whole system itself. So what we're doing is just to count on international level the volume, the overall retention volume available in million cubic meters.
I guess as an extension of that question, I'm just curious, are there other benefits that are being tracked related to additional floodplain storage, such as environmental benefits, ecosystem, so on and so forth?
Yes, sure. I mean, there's a big synergy between flooding and ecology, at least if you're talking about non-technical retention areas like dike relocations, giving the river more room, more space. And there are different systems to measure these effects. They are linked to the European Water Framework Directive. So, for example, every 6 years, really, the fish are counted, the flora and fauna. There's also a regular water bird report carried out like every 10 years. And of course, indirectly, this is also a reflection. If you build more floodplains, if you have more nature, also water birds are coming back. There was, for example, last year in Alsace in France, the first osprey was spotted in more than 100 years. And it's possibly an effect of renaturalization of floodplains. And also in the Netherlands now they have more than 70 ospreys, pairs of ospreys with a nest. So yeah, you see a lot of positive effects too on nature.
Fantastic. I'm going to ask this because I think it's just a really quick question, and then we're going to be out of time. But with regard to the three return events that are of interest for the Rhine, how often are they evaluated for accuracy?
Well, there is a technical obligation by the Floods Directive to have a look at it again every 6 years. So every 6 years you have to look at your definitions and say if it's still valid or not, if you need to modify them or not. Of course, this is not the conclusion every 6 years is not that you have to modify them every 6 years, but when really there's some difference, maybe after 12 years, the recalculation is done.
Very good. Thank you so much for a great presentation, and look forward to hopefully having you join us next time we have the opportunity to have a live conference.
I hope so. Thank you.
Moving on to our third presentation, I'd like to introduce my lovely and talented co-chair for the International Committee, Ms. Serra-Llobet, from the University of California at Berkeley, located in France today. But she's going to present on another side of the world, and that is the Mekong Delta and the Transboundary river management that's becoming a pretty significant issue there as dams are going up and looking at sediment transport. And with that, I'll let you look at her video.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the international session of the ASFPM conference. My name is Serra-Llobet, and today I'm going to talk on behalf of two colleagues from the River Lab at the University of California, Berkeley, Professor Matt Condell and Dr. Raphael Smith, who is also associated with Stanford University. I will present their research about transboundary river basin management to prevent drowning of the Mekong Delta. With David Powers, I'm also the co-chair of the ASFPM International Committee. Transboundary river management was one of the topics that the members of the committee were particularly interested this year. So we thought that organizing a session on this topic would be great. And the results of this research fit perfectly well with the topic. For those of you who are not familiar with the Mekong River is one of the 10 largest rivers in the world. It's located in Southeast Asia and it crosses 6 countries with most of its upper watershed in Chinese territory. 70 million people depend on the Mekong for protein. The Mekong Delta supports a population of 17 million people, and over 140 dams have been built, planned, proposed in the Mekong River Basin. And although these infrastructures can bring regional benefits short-term, they can also create important long-term negative environmental impacts for the Mekong River system. The Mekong Basin supports a large number of human livelihoods and highly diverse ecosystems. The seasonal fluctuation of the river inundates floodplains, creating shallow water habitats for fish. Many residents of the Mekong are adapted to this seasonal flooding. For example, they build houses on stilts above the annual floodwaters. This seasonal fluctuation is critical for fish production. In the wet season, the main river comes up and the flow goes up in the Tonle Sap River, and it expands the area of the Tonle Sap Lake 4 times. The sediment delivery for the Mekong River built the entire Mekong Delta landform during the Holocene. Geologically speaking, the delta is a young landform, having prograded 250 kilometers to its current extent over the last 7,000 years. Here is where the Mekong Delta ended when the pyramids were built. Many of the Mekong's ecosystem services and the livelihoods they support are driven by a continuous flux of sediment from the upstream catchment to the downstream floodplains and the delta. It's like a conveyor belt. But as I mentioned before, over 140 dams have been built, planned, or proposed. These dams are trapping sediment that formerly flowed to the delta, and this is rapidly changing the sediment budget of the basin. What could happen to the delta sediment supply if all the dams proposed are built in the Mekong River Basin? If that happened, only 4% of the sediment could arrive to the delta. That's exacerbated with the sand mining, and the land loss is also accelerated by groundwater pumping in the delta. Big changes in the sediment budget of the Mekong due to the construction of the dams can intensify flood risk for the 17 million people living in the delta, which are already vulnerable to global climate change and sea level rise, and the accelerated subsidence from groundwater pumping. As the land progressively disappears in the delta, floods are becoming more frequent and severe. Strategic planning can reduce environmental impacts for giving hydroelectric power production. There are approaches to pass sediments around and through dams to maintain sediment continuity. These have been required for two mainstream dams in the lower Mekong by the Mekong River Commission. However, these techniques add expense to dam construction and are rarely implemented. In this article, this team shows the results of the analysis of the impacts of strategic planning for the 3S River Basin, which includes the Sezan, Shrepok, and the Sekong rivers in Vietnam. The 3S River Basin is the biggest downstream tributary. This diagram shows Pareto optimal curves for hydropower development in the 3S River Basin. Here we can see that the dams that has been built today generate 60% of the potential hydropower, but they trap 90% of the sediment. However, if the least damaging dams had been built first, the basin could generate 70% of potential hydropower, trapping only 20% of the sediment. This result shows the importance of a strategic planning for dam construction, especially in large river basins like the Mekong. This research team has been awarded this year with the Aspen Institute Italia Award for hydropower research on the Mekong River for this analysis. For the Mekong as a whole, to conclude, there's not much that can be done at this point, as some of the worst dams have been already built. Lack of coordinated transboundary management of the waters and sediment of the Mekong River now threaten to exacerbate the delta's already severe flooding problems and permanently put most of the delta underwater by 2100. Considering all the drivers together, the business as usual scenario results in more than 90% of the delta sinking below sea level by 2100. However, if coordinated transboundary basin management was possible, avoiding the most impactful dam sites, incorporating sustainable sediment management into dam design and operation, but also controlling sand mining and groundwater pumping, the subsidence rate could be reduced and only 20% of the delta could be submerged by 2100. The research I'm presenting today analyzes the cumulative threats of changing sediment budget of the Mekong and recommends sustainable management strategies for this river. But the take-home message is that this can be applied elsewhere. There's a goal rise of building dams globally. However, with strategic planning and transboundary coordination among river basins, there's the potential to develop hydropower while minimizing negative environmental impacts such as flood risk. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and please check these articles or contact the authors if you want to have more details about this research.
I'd like to thank everybody for joining us for the International Committee's session on transnational flood risk management. I think you can see from actually from certainly from the last two presentations that that the issues around the water bodies that that flow back and forth between various nations affect a lot more than flood risk, but they affect the ecology. They affect you know, drinking water supply. They, you know, it goes on and on. As and even to the place of the ground that we stand on. So with that, I bringing back in all of the folks who are still with us. Unfortunately, Dr. Bora had to go negotiate with Mexico on some transnational issues, but thought we would go ahead and just kind of back into some of the questions that we didn't get to. We've got a few minutes to talk about those. And so, Marc, with regard to your presentation, the question that Casey asked is, what is the community response to the initiative? I guess the initiative of the ICPR. Is there widespread knowledge of the risk from the Rhine and acknowledgement of the need for floodplain management?
Oh, well, I would interpret this question like community reactions to the flood mapping, which is actually not our initiative. It's sparked off by the European Union, but okay, we are part of it. And I would say that when the first flood maps were published around, let's say 20 years ago, even before the Floods Directive, it was really controversial. People feared about their property values, and also some local mayors were really furious and that sort of things. But nowadays it has become a standard and also become accepted, and some people appreciate the availability of the maps, which are, by the way, free of charge. However, it also depends on if there has been a flood in the past or not. Some people see the maps and they don't believe it. Even if it's science and it's a fact, they don't believe it and they don't really take precautions. Well, others do. It also depends on the country. In the Netherlands, for example, there's a high perception, high response, a lot of good campaigns also. It's also not done with publishing the maps. You should have campaigns and inform about what people can do.
Very good. Alejandro, I don't know if this is something that you're well versed on, but I'll give it a shot. Can you give a brief summary of the differences between US and Mexico levee design?
Yes, so, well, not from a very deep, you know, difference, but one of the biggest differences is that the availability of data. The United States typically has more availability to fund data sets. The information you get from some sites of the US is more robust than what you get from the south side of the US. So, but in essence, they all come to be very similar. There is approaches, there's just a difference in approach. They'll have a freeboard as far as to the application of the levee height, but they'll have to use Mexico's, you know, drainage design approaches to determine the water level. But when it comes down to, border waters, then that's something that the IBWC would make a rule on, and that's what's rule. So, but if you have a levy on the United States side, that will comply with the FEMA requirements, and if you build a levy on the Mexican side, that would comply with the federal Mexican agency, which is called CONAGUA, or similar to FEMA, that will determine what that level of protection needs to be.
And I think APERBA went through the design discharge as well, or I'm sorry, that you went you went through the design discharge that's used on the lower Rio Grande. Is that right?
Yes. So based on that, in that case, that applies for both sides. Now the freeboard might be calculated differently.
Okay. Last question, and I'll leave this for Alejandro if you want to add something to this, but I think it's directed at Dr. Bora, which is, are you partnering with Mexico? And if not, has there been any issues with any of your projects?
For the experience I have worked with Dr. Bora, yes, it is very common for both countries to partner because both benefit. I mean, the water is not only, it's not going just to Mexico, it comes from Mexico. So it's typically that across the border there is collaboration in projects, and these projects are always politically challenged. So yes, there is always hurdles that need to be crossed. But probably Dr. Bora can maybe elaborate a little more.
Okay. Anna, it's interesting to see the impacts of the constructed dams. With the construction of the dams, has this also brought urbanization and further encroachment of the Mekong Delta? If so, is a lot of other public infrastructure being introduced that may also accelerate flooding?
Okay, yeah, well, of course, yeah, there's a levy effect, definitely. So whenever there's an infrastructure, the urbanization increases around it. But I don't know the details about which proposals there are, but there are some proposals of building more levees in the Delta, and a big debate about if that's the only solution or they should be looking at different options that could complement each other. Because another big question there is who's going to maintain the levees. So these are countries that are not rich, and these infrastructures need a lot of maintenance, and it's sometimes something that is not very well planned from the beginning, and inheriting aging infrastructure can have also negative consequences long term. So there's a big debate on which are the best combination of solutions for the Delta right now.
Fantastic. Well, with that, we're out of time. I appreciate everybody's attention. Appreciate our speakers and some wonderful presentations that we had. I hope everybody enjoyed it as much as I did, and looking forward to seeing some more